Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the New Muslim Academy. The Quran is the final testament and it is the timeless miracle. It is a book of guidance and not just a book that is read by the clergy, by the scholars, but rather a book that is read by the scholars and the masses at large. No doubt the Quran is central to absolute guidance. And as such, I want to share with you 4 tips that you can take on board as a new Muslim developing your journey with the Quran. Firstly, brothers and sisters, given that the recitation of the Quran and our relationship with the Quran is an act of worship in and of itself, then fundamentally, as rule number 1, when we engage with it, we need to be sincere in our engagement. What does being sincere mean? Well, being sincere here means that we should engage the Quran seeking the pleasure of God Almighty alone. It shouldn't be that we engage the Quran for any other alternative reason, alternative purpose. The only purpose should be the pleasure of God Almighty, as is the same with every act of worship, our prayer, our compulsory charity, our pilgrimage, our fasting, anything that is considered an act of worship in and of itself. Then a prerequisite for it benefiting us, for it being accepted, is that it has to be solely for the sake of God Almighty, seeking His pleasure alone. So this is tip number 1, to purify our intentions and to make God Almighty our purpose for our engagement with the Quran. That's number 1. Number 2, no doubt, we want to be guided by the Quran. So we need to take an objective approach with the Quran. What does this mean? Well, we should be humble in our relationship with the Quran, humble in the sense that we want to seek guidance from our interaction and engagement with the book. And being objective means giving the Quran a real chance to guide us, as opposed to us reading the Quran in a subjective way, approaching the Quran with any previous bias that we might have, and then trying to forcefully interpret the Quran in a way that conforms to our bias. Okay, so if we read the Quran with a subjective approach, then the Quran won't guide us. And indeed, the Quran is a spiritual cure, it is a physical cure, it is a guide. But if we adopt an objective approach with the Quran, then we will see the Quran helping us to help ourselves. So that's tip number 2. Have an objective approach, seeking guidance from our relationship with the Quran. Number 3, we need to take the necessary means to improve our ability reciting the Quran, so that over time we can recite the Quran as closely as possible to how the Messenger, peace and blessings be upon him, received the Quran from God Almighty. Okay, now this will require time, and no doubt it requires a responsible, a knowledgeable teacher, and the New Muslim Academy can help you with this. So please do write a message through to helpdesk@newmuslimacademy.org seeking the Academy's programs in relation to assisting our development when it comes to the recitation of the Quran. No doubt, as a new Muslim, the Arabic language is a foreign language. It isn't a mother tongue, and depending on your age, we interact with new languages differently. But the beautiful thing is God Almighty has made the Quran easy for us to learn, easy for us to understand. So if we do a little bit, we will be surprised beyond measure. So definitely seek out a knowledgeable teacher, and like I said, the Academy can help you with this to improve your recitation of the Quran. The better your recitation becomes, the easier it is to read. The easier it is to read, the more you can cover in the Arabic language, and there are great rewards in reading the Quran in the Arabic language, even if you don't understand. Okay, that's tip number 3. What about tip number 4? Well, tip number 4 is to ponder over the meanings of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God Almighty, when He revealed the Quran, He revealed in it a message to the Quraysh, to the Arabs who were disbelievers, who were witnessing the revelation of the Quran. He said, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ? Do they not ponder over this Quran that is being revealed, ponder over its meanings? Now, what is the simplest form of pondering, or what we call in the Arabic language tadabbur. The most simplest form is that you take a verse, you understand what the verse is teaching you in terms of knowledge and what the verse is calling you to in terms of action. Okay? Once you do this, you've understood an ideal, because the Quran only calls us towards ideals. And then you ponder that here the Quran has taught me an ideal. Where am I from this ideal? How close am I to this ideal? And if there's a gap between me and this ideal, then what is the nature of this gap? And what are the reasons for this gap? And what can I do to close the gap? This is the basic form of tadabbur, of pondering over the meanings of the Quran and interacting with the Quran. I leave you with these 4 tips. I love you all for the sake of Allah. And until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.